Thanks everyone. What a fascinating first session we just had with Tracy, and as Charlie said, a huge amount of energy and impetus now to push through, enjoy ourselves for the rest of this fantastic lineup. And our first full panel today is discussing questions around what we're calling modern municipalism, the case of what it takes to transform the functioning of city government. This is a fascinating area. We talk an awful lot, and rightly, about the emergence of metro mayors, combined authorities. They're a massive live and interesting aspect of how things operate across Yorkshire, a growing part of how we think about how cities operate too. But the everyday city governance in this country, the hard questions of getting the urban policies right, of making local government function well within urban and large town contexts, we sometimes, I think, overlook that part of the picture. Cities are obviously hotbeds of diversity, of churn in the populations, of enormous disparities, but also enormous areas with huge wealth and also poverty. It's in those gaps, it's in that complexity, it's in that diversity that we find both the vigour, the vitality of our cities, where a lot of that innovation and innovative practice can emerge, as people in the room today can attest, but also where some of that challenge comes in, sometimes the most difficult sort of places to organise government as well. So there's a huge number of innovative practices to unpack, there's opportunities to explore, there are challenges afflicting a sector still in the grip of financial crisis as well. Our panel today is brilliantly placed to discuss all those challenges, opportunities, the future of English cities from their own particular points of view. So in no particular order, Sarah Calkin is the editor of the Local Government Chronicle, perhaps probably the most well-read, widely read of all the local government-facing publications. A long-established journalist and commentator on all things local gov. Kersten England is the chair now of the Young Foundation and of the 2025 Bradford City and Culture programme, and was previously the chief executive of both York and Bradford City Councils. I'm not sure I've got the exact titles of those, right?
No, it doesn't
matter. It'll matter later when she tells me off. Immediately to my left, Councillor Tom Hunt is, for me, a wondrous thing. Forgive me, Tom. Why? Because a genuine academic policy wonk turned councillor, turned, of course, leader of our brilliant host city today, Sheffield City Council, without whom this panel could not happen. They're also sponsoring this panel, so massive thanks to them. Jo Johnston has come from Manchester to join us today and spoke of a good transit across, always a good sign, where she's head of the Reform and Innovation programme there for Manchester City Council. So please join me in welcoming our brilliant panel for this discussion. Tom, I'm going to start with you, if that's all right. You're in a position to cast, I think, a lot of light on these questions about how English cities work, how they're governed, where the challenges and the opportunities really are. Sheffield, I think you'd be able to tell us, is a city in a period of massive, rapid change. The council itself is going through a really interesting moment of change as well. Where does Sheffield find itself now? What lessons can we learn for the rest of the system about the future of local government in cities?
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Perhaps in a room like this, your description of me is a compliment, but perhaps in other rooms not so much. But no, thank you very much indeed. And welcome to Sheffield, where, as people pointed out, the sun always shines and we have rooms such as this. This is the home of the company of Cllrs in Hallamshire, which is 400 years old this year. And it was set up to uphold the quality and standards of steel and cutlery in the city. And the reason I would draw attention to that is, I'll come to in a moment, but today Sheffield is a city that, yes, has still significant strengths in engineering and advanced manufacturing, but also in digital technology, green aviation, in materials technology, a city that's putting culture at the heart of our growth plans, a city with the UK's first civil service policy campus outside of London and 2 world-leading universities. But what I take from somewhere like this is that what places need to be able to be successful is well-resourced, as this room demonstrates, place-focused institutions whose principal focus is to put the interests of that place first. And I think you've asked about institutions in the city. So let me come on to the City Council. I'm not going to rehearse the point in front of this audience too much, but it is the case that Sheffield has lost £856 per person over the last decade, which inhibits our capacity to be able to do the bold programmes that we would like to now do. So I do think that when it comes to, when we're talking about devolution by default and councils taking on more responsibility alongside MCAs, we can't shy away from the funding question. Yes, we want to have brave and bold solutions, but you need the time and the space that being well-resourced provides to be able to do that. And I also do worry that it touches upon the trust question that Tracy spoke about earlier on, because if you devolve significant responsibilities to institutions which don't have the capacity to be able to fully realise those new powers and responsibilities, then I think all you do is run the risk of further weakening people's trust in institutions and local politicians to be able to deliver. And I think sometimes we need to make sure that the policy conversation about devolution doesn't run too far ahead of the actual reality of those institutions that we are talking about. So I sincerely hope that from 2025-26 we will start to see a reversal in the funding gap that we've experienced for the last 14 years. And if you listen to what Jim McMahon and Angela Rayner have been saying over the last few months, there is, I think, some hope that we can take from the fact that they're talking about putting back in some of those deprivation factors into the local government funding formula that were stripped out over the last decade. So that is one, I think, that we can't shy away from. I think other factors are around having a really strong, genuine set of partnerships between central and local government. And like Tracy, I've probably had more contact in the last 3.5 months with government than in the last couple of years that I've been involved in local politics. That speaks from the fact that there's a respect and a value for local government that wasn't there previously, and that gives me hope to be able to work with them on new affordable house building, big regeneration schemes, supporting our industries in the way that we want. There is a recognition that the centre needs to work with the local and regional partners in order to be successful on those national missions. So I take a lot of heart from the current moment that we're in.
That's really helpful, thank you. I'm going to do a quick follow-up as I work down the table, if that's all right, so a super quick follow-up with you, Tom. You talk really compellingly about how that relationship centre to locality is starting to shift under the current circumstances. That's incredibly encouraging to hear. What about the other thing we were talking about earlier as well, the other side, the flip side of the coin, the council to community connection? How's that playing out in Sheffield? Because there's some innovative practices happening in the council.
I see the role of the council as being the convener of this place that we know and love called Sheffield. And that means we've got a unique ability to be able to bring together people and partners to be able to work out what are the needs of our communities. But in doing so, convening doesn't mean doing. Convening means bringing people together, leading the conversation, but then letting go. And we are engaged in a number of initiatives across the city where there's some, I think, innovative practice where we are stepping back and saying it is not the council who will be the best place to lead on this. In the northeast of Sheffield, where we've got significant health challenges, a gap in healthy life expectancy of 15 years from the northeast to the southwest of our city, we are taking a community development approach to health in that area. And when I say we, I don't mean the council, I mean we, a set of partners led by really innovative thinking from within our ICB, alongside people like Voluntary Action Sheffield and communities who are actually working out what are the needs of the people in this place, how can we best place tackle those health inequalities. And the nice thing about it is that we are testing and learning as we go along. And I think if we talk about modern municipalism, it has to be founded on not knowing the answers when you begin. You have to be able to experiment, you have to test and learn, and you have to be prepared to take risks. And I think we're seeing in some of our work really good practice of that. And I'm heartened that we now actually have a government which is talking about public service reform in a way where they want to work with cities, but they're saying to us, we don't have a predetermined set of outputs at the end of this. It is up to places, local leaders like myself, to determine what are the needs of your area, and then we will work with you to provide additional capacity to try things. And if it doesn't work, will take the learning to inform the next programme rather than writing it off as a failure. And so I take a lot of heart from the fact that people like Georgia Gould and Jim McMahon are having that conversation with cities like ours at the moment.
Thank you, Tom. Kirsten, coming to you next. I think there's a thread to pick up here.
There is.
And Tom's kind of given us an idea. It's a vision of municipal leadership that's about being humble enough to let go at times, perhaps more than happens normally now, but also to come into conversations not necessarily knowing or thinking you know what all the right answers are. That's very challenging for institutions to get right, isn't it?
Absolutely. No, it's great to be here, though I will just have to say I find it slightly triggering to be here looking at the swords on the wall, because one of my more alarming moments in local government was a difficult budget discussion in New York in the Guildhall, which I had to stand down because someone jumped on a table and grabbed the mace, a protester. And I led everybody out of the council chamber into the main bit of the Guildhall, only to find that we were having an exhibition of Viking weaponry. So there were axes all the way down and Viking helmets. So it is slightly triggering. And Tom will have had some of those moments himself where that participative and representative democracy butts up against. No swords, yeah, no, absolutely, doing your risk assessments in advance. But anyway, no, I am really heartened by much of what I am hearing. I'm a huge fan of devolution, working for both York and Bradford. I supported the council leaders to work long and hard with governments to reach a settlement from West Yorkshire, and I think Tracy's kind of ebullience and ambition and creativity with which she's approaching it is beginning to really deliver dividends, as well as the kind of building the right sets of relationships with localities. And I think there is much, as Thomas said, to be heartened by in terms of some of the initial positioning of this government, both in terms of that kind of return to progressive redistribution, which I think is critical in terms of levelling up in the north, but some of the policy changes we're hearing announced, most of which are very welcome, whether it's on children's services last week about market regulation, or whether indeed it is about the kind of shocking state of the housing stock and the need to get to decency and increase the stock. But I am worried that, that places faced with significant necessary and disruptive change, because let's not pretend that what we're facing as a nation doesn't require disruptive change, unless there is more attention to the conditions for success, and particularly in terms of unlocking the innovative, creative potential of the people and communities and agencies of that place, are going to fail to get properly upstream on some of the drivers of the issues that we face as acute, chronic circumstances many of our people and communities face, and failure demand, which results in a drain on the state's coffers. Yeah, and I do agree the best way to a happy, healthy life with that state, and it is to be in work and good work. So I absolutely recognise that focus on growth, but I think there's a critical attention to the capacity and the agency of communities, which I haven't heard much about yet, other than the community covenant consultation being launched, which, having operated community covenants at the local level, many of us, for a long time, they're only as good as the strength of relationships you are building and the ability to work properly with parity of esteem and understanding the dynamics of power to bring people to the table effectively. Now look, I know local government is entirely capable of embracing this. In my 33 years in local government, whether in Kirklees that led a whole system review of water management and supply for Kirklees district, championing people in the 90s, and they were really forerunners of the whole scrutiny process actually, which came in the 2000s, whether it was in Calderdale, where Incredible Edible led to the transformation of the whole Calder Valley around local food growing, but transformed the economic prospects and skills prospects, and led to the community right to grow, where for a quid we allowed people to cultivate orchards and vegetable patches on the edge of football pitches that we weren't using, abandoning the Allotments Act 1948, which prohibits you from doing lots of things, getting out of the way and allowing these ideas to come forward. Whether it was in York, where we ran Genius York, which was an open innovation system, crowdsourcing and funding ideas to tackle some of the intractable issues, like ageing well, so produced lots of adaptations to local housing using open source programs from Hungary and bring it together with academics and people who've lived experience. Or whether indeed born in Bradford, where actually the driver was from the universities and the NHS, the world's largest longitudinal study of childhood development, enabled us Tom knows the story, to actually adopt the clean air zone, because we've done the detailed forensic impact study about the health of children and the levels of COPD, and the redesign of neighbourhoods to produce better. I know we can do all these things, but look, there are some conditions for success, and I'll touch briefly, but I won't say much more than, I mean, Tom has talked about moving beyond precarity, really, and the fragility. Someone's already referenced the fragility in the HEI, in the higher education sector, and you can replicate that across our sectors at the moment. We have to move, there has to be a reset of the fiscal base of funding of local government. There has to be more freedoms and flexibilities about revenues produced and where you can direct those monies on a properly upstream basis to prevent. There's a lot of work going on. I think Localis was saying quite a bit about that last year. I completely agree about the reset relationships. For many of my years as a chief exec, it's felt a bit like being in Wolf Hall or The Mirror and the Light, dealing with central government, of being the far-flung, troublesome provinces, and actually you brought in, you know, being managed and being only brought in if you were deemed eligible. That whole moving beyond that earned autonomy and getting to proper co-production of policy, thinking through investment programmes, whether we'd ever get the Treasury to think about Dell lines with us, you know, as part of the spending review, but we absolutely need to see more of that interplay. I mean, of course, the policy campus is a great thing. The Darlington campus is the same thing. Should have more of that flow. But, you know, hey, I'm not beyond thinking the Council of the North was based in Europe once upon a time. That was where government was for a period of time in the Middle Ages. Let's think a bit more radically about how we build multi-level governance, I suppose, is what I'm saying, and particularly, you know, as we are going to have a devolution white paper and the possibility of unitarisation, let's also think about that not just as a top-down, but as a, what is multi-level governance, but how do you make a multi-level governance system work with parity of esteem, co-production, effective investment at the right levels, doing things at the right spatial levels. More, I think, to come on that. I do think there needs to be the best places, and Sheffield is absolutely one of them, that place leadership, that convening of the assets of the place is going on. But I have to say, some stuff has got in the way, like the whole ICB, ICP structures, where are health and wellbeing boards now? You know, I hear Tracy talking about, well, we sit on each other's boards, then multiple meetings. I don't think that's as effective a way of driving attention, and also bringing the community sector, the faith sector, the social enterprise sector, alongside all the public agencies and the business sector, into those arenas. Again, can we get into the space of co-commissioning rather than purchaser provider with the voluntary sector? Can we, you know, the procurement legislation is still heavy on local government, whereas the NHS has much more freedoms. In fact, can we rationalise that? Can you have, you know, the kind of qualifying frameworks for the voluntary sector to be involved, rationalised? You have to multiply qualify to actually tender for things. I'd like, you know, and I think, and our colleague has also already challenged us, that whole debate about participant and representative democracy, we need a new social contract, I think. The Young Foundation is speaking quite a lot about the need for a new social contract. Now, I am an old defender of the local state, don't get me wrong. So I am not about dismantling representative democracy. I've worked for councillors for many, many years who are committed day in, day out. As we heard Tracy and Tom, and they know their communities, but I think getting the right relationship between participative and representative democracy, and that involves quite deep cultural change still, which is ongoing. I think Joe might talk about this in local government, because the whole kind of professional knows best, the hierarchy and the deference, and we'll allow you in. We replicate it horizontally and vertically at the moment in this country, and moving beyond, I almost think it's our class system is getting in the way. There's a assumption about who is superior to whom. We really need to do more work on that kind of, you know, and that goes for inside our organisations. So I will stop a bit, but I remember, you know, insisting that we jemmy the lock off at the services depot, because the managers were upstairs in a clean, warm office with carpet, and they had a security keypad so that dirty boots didn't come upstairs. Now, what was dirty boots? That was the frontline staff. Yeah, I remember going to depots where there were no proper showers, there was no drying room for people working in refuse collection. Those things get in the way. Those are the people who live in our communities. The bulk of people in local government are in less than the average wage in the UK. They understand many of the communities that we're most concerned about. We need to turn some of that hierarchy and instead start listening to our people with lived experience who are also magistrates, they're school governors, they coach sporting teams at the weekend. They are also part of our community. I think that, and finally, just in terms of some of the things I think we haven't had an effective agenda around the hyper-local, the regeneration of the hyper-local, and our communities have been desiccated of a lot of their assets. And I see in the places where I've had where we've had community anchors that are asset owning, driving revenues from, I can see the impact they're making on providing opportunities and pathways for people to actually their prosperity and higher levels of well-being. Now, not everything was right about SRB, not everything was right about work in Edwards Fund and Edward Renewal, but we need, just like with Sure Start, to learn some of the lessons from those and start to think, we've thought a lot about high streets. We haven't thought a lot about those huge estates that have nothing left on them practically. But I see where they are remaining, the difference that those are making. But I'll stop there. There's more to say, but I'll stop there.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much, Kersten. And Sarah, I can't resist bringing you in now. Your role affords you a kind of a bird's eye view of these massive trend lines. We've just heard that from Kersten and from Tom, and there's some sort of home truths here for the whole sector, aren't there? Just to be a little bit provocative. For one, in all the period and all the innovations we've just been talking about and hearing about, the sector's always been in a state of some kind of crisis. There's always been some kind of looming reorganisation. There's always been some kind of financial issue. And sometimes that's a driver for innovation and change in these local government contexts as well. But give us a sense of where you see these trend lines leading us.
Yeah, sure. So as you said in the introduction, LGC is the leading news title for local government, and we're writing about investigating and analysing the biggest issues facing councils and the wider sector. We do have a history going back to 1855, but I'm not going to go back that far. But I think to sort of think about where is local government now, what are some of the traits, and how perhaps the policies of the past kind of 14 years have shaped them, I thought would be useful. So obviously austerity and the squeeze on funding has been sort of profound in terms of its impact, I think, on councils. But I actually think there's a bit of a divide that's opened up at this point between those councils that perhaps recognised early on, actually, this is the new normal, and those that sort of hunkered down and salami sliced and waited for austerity to pass. You know, to be fair to them, we were told at the time we're all in this together and, normal times will resume, but, 15 years later and they haven't. So, and I think those councils that did recognise that early on sort of really thought about, well, how can we do things differently? They thought about working more closely with their communities and getting communities to do more for themselves. And the most obvious example of that is the number of libraries now that are run by voluntary groups and community groups. But that sort of idea of empowerment has now been taken in some really quite interesting directions in terms of thinking about reducing dependency and things like that. And gone are the sort of days of diktats from the town hall in this good councils anyway, trying to sort of embed themselves more in neighbourhoods and join up with services, and then Manchester is doing a lot of that. So I think that's been sort of one big theme that's kind of really shaped where the sector is. I think those councils that, there's been some quite spectacular failures of certain councils in recent years, and often one of the things that comes out in there is they were trying to kind of invest their way out of it. They were looking to make use of the cheap borrowing at the time, and they had a strategy of sort of investing to generate income to prevent them having to cut services. And it's only now some of those councils are looking at things like moving to fortnightly collections and stuff like that. So there was a sort of a group of councils that tried that. It didn't quite work. But I think what we really need to be careful with in that is to say that this idea that councils can behave a bit more commercially than perhaps they did in the past is entirely wrong. I think some councils approached it in a very I don't think cavalier is the right word, but perhaps not taking account of risks as they might have done. But there are actually many councils that were thoughtful about it, measured, sensible, and that have invested in kind of regenerating their places, which has had a knock-on effect in terms of economic growth and greater business rates and things like that, and all kind of invested in, you know, trying to make services that can deliver an income, and that is part of the picture. So I don't think commercialism in local government should be a dirty word. I think we need to have a more nuanced view on that. And I think the other big theme of the period has been devolution, and we've obviously seen the metro mayors in most urban areas now in the country, and we're now kind of at the point of what happens to everywhere else. And this government is obviously very keen on kind of rolling out that model nationwide. I think there's a lot of concern in some of the more rural county areas that is that actually the right fit for us? Does it translate here? We're all kind of waiting for the English devolution white paper to see exactly how that local government's going to proceed on that. I'm sure people have seen reports this morning about forced unitarisation of councils of 500,000. So it's going to be a very, very interesting one to watch. I think to sort of the point Tracy was making about working with local authorities, I don't think any council leader was ever enthusiastic about having them there. But in those places where they do have them, I think they mostly do now recognise the value, both of the mayor as a sort of figurehead in a local democracy, but also as the sort of combined authority structures. And the best combined authorities are finding more and more things that they can collaborate on and do together, and they don't need necessarily more powers to do that, although you know, imagine what they could do if they did have more powers. But I think there's a lot of learning there about what's worked and what hasn't, and I'm sure we'll probably want to discuss that more in questions, so I'll stop there.
No, that's brilliant, thank you. And just to quickly follow up on the reorganisation news, obviously it's been petering little hints and messages over the last few weeks. I'm sure almost everyone in the room is thinking about this morning of the big Times story that came out. From your point of view, both sides of the coin, is this going to burn up the political capital of what wants to be a very reforming central government when it comes to the future of local government? And on the other side, just how enraged will local government be by some of the proposed changes? You must have a kind of a finger on the pulse in the way that some of us don't.
Yeah, so I actually think there is a sort of recognition that two-tier as it's currently structured is probably not best for the long term. To that, there's a trust point. It's very confusing for local people, and that sort of perception that counties passing the buck to district or vice versa, even if it's valid because they're not responsible for whatever service it is, doesn't really help with the sort of perceived lack of trust and things. But I think what the government has to do is tread a really fine balance between previous governments tried before, bottom up, come up with your own ideas, and if you've got agreement, we'll do it. And then that's burnt a lot of bridges locally, created lots of rows without that much to show for it. But equally, if they're not prescriptive at all, you're going to have that again. But then they could be too prescriptive. I think you need to have some flex in your population, because you've got to have councils that relate to places. And I think that's the sort of danger, that you can sit in Whitehall and draw lines on a map that might look sensible to you, but actually don't make any sense to the people that live there. And I think that's what the government needs to be really careful about doing.
Yeah, you can also do that in think tanks sometimes as well, I'm afraid. Sort of draw lines, this will work. I've been to Sheffield 4 or 5 times, this is going to be fine.
There's a few global kind of examples where that's gone badly wrong.
Yeah, that's right. Well, maybe we can get into that. That sounds good. Joe, coming to you, last but of course not least, you in your role in Manchester, one of the big innovative cities of our country, you're at the forefront of the reform innovation policy space. You've got the big, powerful, exemplar structure of the combined authority sitting above you, but of course the work of the City Council is distinctive and has to operate within that structure. How does that work, and what's your take on where reform and innovation now sits for the future of our city?
think we've kind of touched on some of this already in terms of the relationship between the local authorities, all 10 of us, not just Manchester, and GMCA has been really strong. And I think it is about understanding individual roles and responsibilities, where power lies, where those decisions kind of sit, and how we can use each other's collective strengths and abilities to do all of that kind of joint lobbying, if that's up to government, how we set our regional priorities in terms of our kind of infrastructure and system delivery, but then it is also around recognising the individual strengths within each individual kind of local authority and how we need to then drive forward our own kind of reform on that very local level. And we've got to appreciate the nuances between all of that. You know, so what is right for the region will not necessarily be right for every single district, and it's how we interpret that so that we are absolutely delivering the best for our individual people and communities. So when we're thinking about this, it was interesting when you gave your opening piece and talking about devolution and talking, you used the word enabling multiple times, and that's exactly what it is. It's an enabler. But what we all need to be prepared for is, well, what are we going to do with that enabler? When it really comes down to a local level, how brave and bold do we want to be able to change fundamentally how we are delivering services locally? And that's really hard. That takes such strong leadership. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of learning the lessons of the past. A lot of the things when we talk about reform in Manchester, it's not new concepts. What we're talking about is really starting to live those values and embed them within the fabric of our organisation, not looking at individual thematic areas, not looking at kind of project-based approaches, but really challenging ourselves internally around, well, what does reform look like for the whole of the council? So when I first came into post, it was about 4 years ago, and I obviously was getting to know all the existing reform programmes, so I'd meet with children's services, adult services, homelessness, meeting with our place teams, and everybody was telling me the same thing. They were having the same challenges, the same barriers. They were all living the reform principles, but everybody was still doing it in those silos. So part of what we've done over the last couple of years is with all of our partners, which was interesting, listening to the keynote earlier, around, you know, we've talked to DWP locally in terms of what are their priorities, what are their challenges. We've talked to the health system, we've gone out to the colleges, you know, we've gone to the voluntary sector. We've all come up with a joint list of kind of reform priorities for us as a whole system. What are the things we need to work on collectively to be able to really make that fundamental change? So we had a very long list of priorities, which was completely unrealistic, and then we've broken it down into the individual priorities. And so some of this is around our decision making. How do we join up our operating models? How do we engage the voluntary sector in a really good, sustained, funded way? How do we embed community voice right across our decision making, our delivery? But how are we all doing this as a single system, working to those same principles and in the same way? And for us, when we talk about reform, the two overriding things is around being person-centred and early help and prevention. Thinking about austerity, I still have shudders. I joined the council at the time when austerity hit. But one of the things that we can evidence now is where we held our nerve on some of those things around early help and prevention, so especially around children's services is probably the most mature for us. We can see now that things like our looked after children are stabilised, they're not increasing. What we are seeing increasing is our early help and prevention interventions. They're going through the roof, but our individual referrals are coming down. So we can stabilise some of these things. But that took really strong leadership and really difficult decisions 10 plus years ago for us to be able to do that. So now our big challenge internally is, well, how do we take those lessons learned and how do we take that to the next level? So rather than looking at our individual services, how do we learn from some of the work that we have done with GMCA around multiple disadvantage, and how do we really challenge our services to be truly person-centred and really structure all of our service delivery around the individual so that we are not making things more complex and harder for them as their lives get harder.
That's so interesting. And did you want to jump in? Sorry.
No, I was like, brilliant.
Sorry. I agree. And there's something, you used a phrase just there which I think is fascinating. You said it's really hard. You said several times. It's really hard. Tough decisions. But you also used the phrase holding your nerve. Yeah. That you need to do something. You need to try something. You won't be 100% sure it'll pay off. But you need to be in an environment where it can play out and you can find out whether it's made a difference. The stakes being incredibly high. We're talking about services that really impact people's lives. So that's got to be one of the big blockers. And as your evidence base builds up, are you finding it easier to get people to hold their nerve, or is it still a massive challenge?
Okay, it's still really hard. Because this is it, because the financial position is constantly changing. It is getting harder, I don't want to say everything's rosy in Manchester, we are managing a £20 million a year budget pressure, so it is really difficult to do that. But where we're getting to now is having those conversations with other services. So when we're talking about improving life outcomes for children, we're not just talking to children's services, everybody has got a role to play in this. So we are talking to our kind of neighbourhoods directorates and our neighbourhoods teams. We're talking about, if we collectively look at our resources in place, what does that mean? So if we're rolling out things like family hubs, well, how is that connecting in with the plethora of other hubs that are evolving in place? And how do we make sure that we're really taking that in a person-centred way and using those resources and capacity in a different way?
Tom, there's a political dimension to that holding your nerve question, isn't there?
There absolutely is. And I think we entirely agree with that real focus on early intervention. And this is at the core of the public service reform work that we are thinking about in Sheffield and core cities are thinking about. And there's a very good report that core cities and Metro Dynamics did on this, really saying that in order to both create the conditions for individuals to be able to flourish, to remove those barriers that hold people back, but also crucially to reduce demand on public services, then we must put our focus squarely on early intervention, because all of the budget pressures that we're dealing with at the council or schools are, or education and NHS are, they're as a result of sort of public service failure in many ways, because the demand is not being met, and so we see it in increased demand at our end, and so we must put the focus on that early intervention. The payoff, though, may not be in 6 months' time, or in an electoral cycle, or even in 10 years. And you're right about holding your nerve, because we are all in the roles that we have, kind of custodians for a period, and then we hand it on to other people to take up the baton. And the future success of things that we are laying down now, whether it's around how do we roll out our family hubs and put more services in there, how do we really embed our new home care contract, which operates on a locality model, how do we revolutionise the way in which our public transport system operates. The payback will be in 5, 10, 15 years' time. And I'm entirely comfortable with that. But it does take you out of that. You have to be out of that mindset of thinking, is this going to be good for me, for a small group of people in 6 months, 12 months' time? Going back to what Tracy said about the tram, I don't know if you've noticed, we've got some trams.
Not Tracy's tram, but the Tom's trams.
No. But 35 going 40 years ago, very foresighted politicians in Sheffield said we need to have mass transit, we need to have district heating. We've had them for 40 years, and that's because they took brave decisions. Now, that was at some political pain, because my party was in power at the time. They lost seats along the tram route as if roads were getting dug up every single year. Was it the right thing to do? Yeah. Had they looked forward and thought, actually, do you know what, this might cost us? Some people would have undoubtedly been in the room saying, don't do this. So you have to take yourself out of that context. I need a three-party administration that we have come together, Labour, Lib Dem and Green, to put the people of Sheffield first. That's the only way. We're making significant headway. We agreed a cross-party 4-year council plan last year. We hadn't had a council plan for many years before that. And people said to me last year, is it the right year? Do you think we're able to do it? We did, because we put the people of Sheffield first. I think when you have that focus, and you take yourself out of that kind of party first, place second mindset, then you can make some progress. It's hard though.
And I think some of the changes in the environment are going to require exactly that kind of courage and leadership. And again, Sheffield and Bradford both have charging between air zones now. Actually, it's starting to show, the evidence is starting to show that a decline in presentations at A&E for COPD and chronic asthma, and in the places where the clean air zone is, we can start to actually see an increase in well-being. But it's been accompanied by investment in neighbourhoods to create spaces and places for safe, active travel to school and activity. And it's been accompanied by investment also in the hackney carriage licensing trade and the taxi industry to enable them to make the transition. But but the political capital that was expended in getting to that decision was pretty phenomenal, wasn't it? I mean, and someone said, I think the mayor said that people want selfies with her. Well, I know councillors had death threats over the introduction of the charging clean air zone. But now, actually, those communities, which are the poorest communities, which have the poorest air quality, are reaping some of the benefit. And I think but repeatedly, whether it is retrofitting or whether it is decent housing conditions, it's going to require some pretty disruptive shifts and transitions that have to be worked through with communities, with evidence from academics, with kind of longitudinal focus, tracked longitudinally is really important.
And being able to build that evidence base is important for those you're talking to the community, talking to the resident conversations, but Joe, it's also important for the conversations that then go back up to Whitehall. Whitehall needs to see that too, right?
Yes. And this is it, so it is about getting your evidence base right. Well, actually, there's a couple of things, isn't there? Because it's not just about you delivering outcomes for you. Quite often, if we're thinking about this as a whole system, you will be making changes in one part of the system, which is going to reap a benefit in another part of the system. And that's the bit that we just need to be mature and adult about this, is actually we're all playing a part to improve life outcomes for our residents. That's what it's about. And it doesn't matter if you're getting the benefits on your side of the system. We need to stop having that conversation about reprofiling budgets across or, getting returns back. We just need to commit our resources in the best possible way. We absolutely have got to have that evidence base, and it is getting that balance right, isn't it, between what you can demonstrate over time, but then also what can you do in the short term to kind of show indicatively, are we doing the right things? Because what we don't want to do is spend 5 years doing something if we're not going to be getting those outcomes. So it's really getting your data and your evidence base in a good proportionate way so that you can track it on a kind of, well, for me actually the most powerful thing is when you track it on an individual basis. So for example, some of the work that we're doing around multiple disadvantage, what we're trying to do this year is really play with that model between, people hitting crisis and accessing our services, people accessing early help services, but what can we do for people 2 years before they're due to access our services? How do we move into that true preventative space? So we're really pushing the model as far upstream as we can go, and we've just done an individual costed case study for one person. We think at worst the unit cost is £5,000, at best it'll be £1,000. What we're projecting is cost avoidance of £68,000 for that one person. That's phenomenal when you start to think about it in those terms, and that's because we are thinking about it across the whole system. So we're looking at those collective impacts, whether that's on the NHS, whether that's on the criminal justice system, whether that's on our own social care system. So how do we actually keep driving in that way? But it poses us a real challenge, because when we look at how kind of government's been set up over the years, it is around demand responsive services. These functions sit with me as reform and innovation because they do not sit comfortably anywhere else in this system. So we do absolutely need to fundamentally change how we are structured and how we operate to be able to make this work mainstream. And until we have some of those adult conversations, we're just not going to break the back of it.
And yeah, I think that's a conversation with the public as well, isn't it?
Absolutely.
About expectations and to your point about the sort of social contract and what the state can deliver. And we've been talking forever about we've got an ageing population, but I don't think I don't feel like there's been any sort of radical policy shift or anything to sort of reflect that. We just kind of keep on doing what we're always doing, but fewer people are getting care or they're getting less care than they actually need. So I think that's a real important conversation to have, not just within the sector but outside.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, public health practitioners would say we should be starting to talk about ageing well once people reach their early 40s and actually thinking about the things that you can do personally to ensure that you stay.
Abstract going to the gym.
But as independent as possible, as socially connected as possible, as engaged with society as possible. But then there is a whole middle ground debate about how we can adapt the way our places work that enables people to stay independent and in charge of their own destiny. Because most people want to live independently for as long as possible. A choice, don't they? Mastery and control. But we also need to go back to Dilnot and have a think about what do we need to do because it is completely broken. So I think there's change required at every level, from the personal to the institutional to the governmental.
Yes.
Yeah, and on that point around ageing well, there is no way in which we deal with that as I'm thinking about it through the prism of one single institution, whether that is the council or the NHS or whatever. It must require really deep collaboration. A couple of weeks ago, I visited the new discharge hub at Northern General Hospital here in Sheffield